An American plane flew over Cuba, taking routine surveillance footage. No one could have known that these pictures would lead to some of the tensest days in the histories of two countries, but they did. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was October 15, 1962, over a year after the CIA's Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. U.S. intelligence had begun examining pictures taken by a U-2 spy plane just the day before. These grainy photos took the shape of a Cuban missile site, which went on to prompt the creation of XCOM, leading to 13 days Cubans and Americans would never forget. The Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a grueling standoff between Washington and the leaders of Cuba and the Soviet Union. These 2 weeks will forever illustrate the extremities of conflict and the relief of life-saving compromise, especially now, as yet again two countries uneasily hover on the brink of nuclear war. In April 1961, America launched an attack on Cuba. This attack, dubbed the Bay of Pigs invasion, was an attempt to overthrow the new leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. The attempt was crushed within 2 days. Kennedy and the CIA went on examining what went wrong and dreaming up a second attempt. Castro pursued closer ties with the Soviet Union. It was through these ties that Cuba was sent weapons, including the ballistic missiles that would cause the crisis. Upon America's discovery of these sites, the information was examined and presented to the most important men in Washington, including the president at that time, John F. Kennedy, and his brother Robert Kennedy. Robert reported a feeling of stunned surprise at the news. They were assured by Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, that there were in fact no missiles. But their suspicions were confirmed when a pilot in a reconnaissance mission clearly photographed 16 to 35 missile sites. XCOM was formed and a decision had to be made. XCOM stood for Executive Committee of the National Security Council. It was made up of many big figures in the American government, including the Vice President, Secretary of State, and more. The group met every day at 10 a.m. The first meeting would be the day after the decision on the course of action was made, and would continue operating months after the crisis was over. After much debate, Kennedy decided on a naval quarantine of Cuba spanning 500 miles. The quarantine was meant to stop any more materials from getting to Cuba, hopefully preventing the completion of the missiles, as new pictures had shown the work on these sites was continuing, and the weapons would be prepared for war within days. It was also this day that President Kennedy went on television to announce the situation and his course of action to the American public.
This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
It was with these words that he announced to the public of the world his intentions and stance on the issue. People took to the streets to protest for the virtue of peace, both in America and Cuba. Some thought it was a good step, others thought it was a step towards war. People stocked up on supplies in case a rain of bombs did come. People were scared. They were scared for themselves and the world. No one ever wants a war, especially of the nuclear type. As the American public reacted, the naval quarantine was about to encounter its first ship, a Russian tanker called the Bucharest. The question was to search it or to give more time to Khrushchev before going into a situation of open hostility. Kennedy decided to have American vessels trail the ship to allow time for a decision to be made. Meanwhile, the leaders of Washington talked privately with Khrushchev, trying to reach an agreement. The ambassador to Russia at the time was a man named Ford Kohler. Kohler was born and raised in Ohio, before attending the University of Toledo, Ohio, getting a job in the government. He was appointed to the position a couple months before the crisis by John F. Kennedy himself. Through the crisis, Kohler served as an in-between. His place in Russia gave him face-to-face encounters with Khrushchev quite often. Because of this, President Kennedy and XCOM relied heavily on his insight to try to reach a deal with the Soviet Union. Kohler was key in many negotiations, including many almost daily letters between the leaders. Through these letters, the two leaders were making hardly any headway. President Kennedy was letting ships through the quarantine as not to upset Khrushchev, and the work on the missile sites was being expedited. After everything, the two countries were still no closer to an agreement than they had been in the beginning. It was time for action. On October 26, Kennedy ordered the boarding of the first vessel. He carefully chose a ship, the Marukla, because he wanted to show the Soviets that he meant business, but did not want to directly affront them. The Marukla was perfect, as it was not Soviet-owned, just under a Soviet charter. Nothing was found, and the ship was allowed to continue on its journey. He also started preparing for the case of military action being the only option, moving ships around and planning strategies. At 6 p.m., a letter came through from Khrushchev himself. The letter contained a somewhat emotional message of avoiding war. He asked for the searching of ships to stop, his reason being all the missile supplies were already in Cuba. He also asked for the blockade to end, stating that, quote, if assurances were made that the President of the United States would not participate in an attack on Cuba and the blockade lifted, then the question of the removal or the destruction of the missile sites in Cuba would be an entirely different question. The next morning, another letter was received, this time more formal, and obviously not Khrushchev personally writing. The letter offered that if America would remove its missiles from Turkey, the Soviet Union would remove theirs from Cuba, as well as both countries minding their own businesses. Robert Kennedy stated in his memoir that, quote, the proposal the Russians made was not unreasonable and did not amount to a loss to the U.S. or to our NATO allies, end quote. He went on to say that the president had been trying to remove these missiles for the past 18 months. The question had been raised at the NATO meeting during the spring of 1962. The issue was quickly shot down by Turkey, who refused. The president had again asked during the summer, despite the State Department warning they felt it unwise to press the matter. The Turks had objected again. There was also pride to deal with. If America agreed, they would look weak, as well as there was pressure from their NATO allies to attack Cuba without them fully understanding the implications of the actions for their own countries. But the problems were far from over. Tragically, a reconnaissance pilot named Rudolph Anderson was shot down by a missile while flying over Cuba. At this point, ExComm was feeling that the only course of action was to attack Cuba. Quote, there was the feeling that the noose was tightening on all of us, on Americans, on mankind, and that the bridges to escape were crumbling, end quote. Despite the dire circumstance, Kennedy decided to give it one more try at peace. He drafted and sent a letter to Khrushchev, stating that he would be willing to take down the blockade and repeal any military threats that had been made against Cuba and the Soviet Union, if the missiles would be taken down as Khrushchev had stated in his original letter. Khrushchev responded inquiring about the request to take down the missiles in Turkey. Robert Kennedy responded that there could be no arrangement of this sort made under this kind of pressure, and that the decision would have to be made by NATO. However, he also stated that President Kennedy had been trying to remove the missiles from Turkey for a long time, and that he thought within a short time after the crisis was over, the missiles would be gone. He would not outright agree to removing the missiles, but they would be gone soon. The next day a letter was received, a final letter. The missiles would be dismantled, the invasion would be averted, and the world would be at rest once more. The Cuban missiles were removed, and the Turkish ones in the following months. The missiles of Turkey being part of the deal would not be released to the public till the following years. But for now, the two countries were at peace. This and many other instances go to show that compromise is not shot from a gun or spilled in the blood of a man. Compromise is written into letters and converted into speech. Compromise is not violent or rash. Compromise is agreeable and complete. And now, more than ever, what the world needs is compromise. Today's leaders and politicians have much to learn from the events of the past.